If I could erase one night from my life, it would be that one. But apparently the universe had other plans. I stood frozen in the doorway, my keys still dangling from my fingers, because there he was, Lucas Hayes, in my kitchen, barefoot, calm, pouring himself coffee like he'd been living here for years, like he hadn't just completely rearranged my sanity less than 24 hours ago. And for a second, I genuinely considered backing out, closing the door, and pretending I had the wrong apartment, wrong life, wrong everything. But my stupid brain locked me in place as he glanced over his shoulder. And our eyes met. And that was it. That exact moment. Because suddenly every memory I'd been trying to bury came rushing back. The way his voice had dropped. The way my name had sounded different coming from him. And I hated that my chest tightened like it meant something. Like it mattered. Like I hadn't spent the entire morning telling myself it didn't. That it was just a mistake. Just a moment. Just something that should never have happened. And yet here he was. Real, solid, standing 5 feet away in my space, my apartment, my safe zone, holding my favorite mug like he had every right to it. And then he said it, casual, effortless, like he wasn't detonating a bomb in my chest. Hey, roommate. And I swear my brain short-circuited because no, absolutely not. That word didn't make sense. None of this made sense. So I laughed, sharp and too loud, like that would fix it. Like that would rewind the last 12 hours. Yeah, funny, good one. I said, already stepping back already, planning my escape route, because obviously this was some kind of misunderstanding, some cosmic joke. Maybe he was just visiting someone. Maybe he got the wrong unit. Maybe I was still dreaming. But then he set the mug down on the counter, slow, deliberate, and pulled out his phone, and I watched, horrified, as he turned the screen toward me. Lease agreement, signatures, my landlord's name, his name, my address. And my stomach dropped so fast it felt like I missed a step on a staircase. I moved in this morning, he added, like it was nothing, like it didn't change everything. And I couldn't breathe for a second, just stared at the screen, then at him, then back again, because no, this wasn't happening. I had spent hours perfecting the art of avoiding him, deleting his number, replaying every second of that night just to convince myself it meant nothing. And now I couldn't even escape my own living room. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the way he was looking at me. Not awkward, not distant, just steady, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. Like he could see right through every lie I'd built in the last 12 hours. And when he took a step closer, just one, closing the distance enough that I could feel the shift in the air, I panicked, instinctively backing up until my shoulders hit the wall, because this was too much, too close, too real. And he noticed, of course he did, his eyes flickering down for half a second before lifting back to mine. And softer now, quieter, he said, "You really planning to avoid me while we live together?" And I opened my mouth, ready to deny it, ready to pretend none of this affected me, but nothing came out, because the truth was sitting right there between us, heavy, undeniable. And I realized with a sinking, terrifying clarity that this wasn't just a bad situation. This was a trap, and I wasn't sure I wanted to get out. I should have said something clever, something sharp, something that made it clear I was completely unaffected, but instead I just stood there with my back against the wall and my brain running in circles like a broken machine, because Lucas was still too close, not touching, not even trying to, but somehow it felt worse that he was choosing not to. Like the space between us was intentional, controlled, and that made everything 10 times more dangerous. "I am not avoiding you," I finally said, which was a lie so obvious I almost winced hearing it out loud. And he did not even argue, just tilted his head slightly like he was studying me, like I was a problem he had already figured out the answer to. And that annoyed me more than anything else, because I needed him to be confused, to be just as off balance as I was. But he was not. He was calm, steady, completely at ease in a situation that was actively ruining my ability to function. "Good," he said simply, and turned back to the counter like that settled it. Like we were normal, like we had always been normal. And I pushed myself off the wall too quickly, grabbing onto the first thing I could reach, which happened to be the back of a chair, because if I stayed still any longer I was going to spiral. "You could have told me," I added, trying to sound annoyed instead of completely thrown off, "about moving in." And he glanced at me again, just briefly this time. "I did not know it was you until this morning," he said, and that hit differently than I expected, because it meant this was not planned, not intentional, just another terrible coincidence layered on top of an already bad situation, and somehow that made it worse, because there was no one to blame, no easy way out, just reality pressing in on both sides, and I let out a short laugh that did not sound like mine. Of course, I muttered, running a hand through my hair, because obviously the universe thought this was funny. Obviously it decided I had not suffered enough yet. And then there was silence, thick and stretched, the kind that made every small movement feel louder, the soft clink of his spoon against the mug, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, my own breathing way too noticeable, and I hated how aware I was of everything, especially him, the way he moved, the way he seemed completely unbothered, like last night was not sitting between us like a loaded question neither of us wanted to ask out loud. We should just forget it, I said suddenly, because I needed to say something. Anything that would put distance between us, something that would make this easier, cleaner, safer, and he paused, just for a second, the smallest hesitation, before setting the spoon down. And when he turned to face me fully this time, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the air changed temperature. Forget it? He repeated, not mocking, not dismissive, just repeating it like he wanted to hear how it sounded out loud. And I nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, it was a mistake. It happens, we move on, I said, words tumbling over each other, because if I slowed down I might actually think about what I was saying, and that would be worse, much worse. And he took a step closer again, not enough to trap me, just enough to make my pulse spike in a way that felt deeply inconvenient, and his voice dropped slightly, quieter, more focused. If that is what you want, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made my chest tighten again, because it did not sound like agreement. It sounded like a challenge, and I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze, to not look away, to not back up this time, because I needed to prove something, even if I was not sure what. It is, I said, and for a moment neither of us moved, just stood there in that fragile, stretched space. And then he nodded once, simple, controlled, like he had accepted my answer, and turned away again. But somehow that felt worse than if he had argued, because it left me standing there with the uncomfortable realization that I had just set a boundary I was not entirely sure I could keep. The next few hours felt like a test I had not signed up for, because no matter where I went in the apartment, he was there, not in an obvious way, not hovering, just existing, which somehow made it worse, like the space had shifted to accommodate him, and now I was the one out of place. And I kept telling myself to act normal, to treat this like any other roommate situation, except nothing about this was normal. Not the way my awareness kept snapping back to him, not the way every small sound pulled my attention whether I wanted it to or not. The quiet movement of him opening cabinets, the soft creak of the floor under his steps, even the faint sound of his breathing when the apartment fell into one of those strange, stretched silences, and I hated it. Hated how my focus kept drifting, hated how my body seemed to recognize him before my brain could catch up. So I did what any rational person would do. I avoided the common areas as much as possible, stayed in my room longer than necessary, pretended I had things to do that absolutely could not be done anywhere else. But avoidance only works when the other person plays along, and Lucas clearly was not interested in that, because at some point in the afternoon, just when I thought I had successfully created enough distance to breathe again, there was a knock on my door, soft but deliberate, and I froze immediately, staring at the wood like it might disappear if I ignored it long enough. "Ethan," he called, calm as ever, and I squeezed my eyes shut for a second because of course he would use my name like that, like it belonged in his mouth, like it had not completely undone me the night before. "What?" I answered a little sharper than I intended, and there was a pause, just long enough to make me regret the tone. "We should figure out how we are splitting things," he said, practical, reasonable, normal. And that almost made me laugh because how was he able to switch to something so ordinary when everything felt anything but? I opened the door halfway, enough to see him leaning casually against the frame, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable, and I forced myself to step out, to not stay hidden like that. Would solve anything, right? Yeah, utilities, groceries, whatever, I said quickly, crossing my arms like that would somehow ground me, and he nodded, pushing off the frame to stand properly in front of me. And suddenly the hallway felt narrower than it had 5 minutes ago, like the walls had shifted just to make this more difficult. "We can keep it simple," he said, and I nodded again, even though I was not really listening, because my brain was too busy tracking the small details, the way his sleeves were pushed up slightly, the faint crease between his brows when he was thinking, the fact that he was still too close, not touching, never touching, but always just within that invisible boundary that made my pulse act stupid. "And about last night," he added, and everything in me immediately went on high alert, like my body had been waiting for that exact phrase, like it had been bracing for it without my permission, and I straightened instinctively, ready to shut it down, to reinforce what I had said earlier. But then he stopped, just stopped mid-sentence, like he had changed his mind, and the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. "Never mind," he finished instead, stepping back just slightly, creating space that should have been a relief, but was not really, because now it felt like something unfinished was hanging in the air between us, something unresolved, and I hated that even more than the tension itself. "No, say it," I said before I could stop myself, because apparently I had lost all control over my better judgment today, and his eyes flicked back to mine, something sharper there now, something more focused. "I was going to ask if you were sure you want to pretend it meant nothing," he said, and there it was. Again, that quiet, steady tone that made everything feel more real than I wanted it to be, and I opened my mouth, ready to repeat the same answer, ready to insist on it. But the words caught somewhere on the way out, because standing this close, looking at him like this, it was suddenly a lot harder to lie convincingly, and I realized with a slow, sinking clarity that living together was not going to make this easier. It was going to make it impossible to ignore. The air between us stretched tight, like something that could snap if either of us moved the wrong way, and I hated that I was the one who broke first, because of course I was. It did not mean anything. I said, too fast, too firm, like if I pushed the words out hard enough they might actually become true, and Lucas just looked at me, not arguing, not agreeing, just looking, and that somehow felt worse than anything else, because it meant he was letting me sit in my own contradiction, letting me hear how hollow it sounded. And I shifted my weight, suddenly aware of how close we still were, how the hallway seemed to shrink around us with every second that passed. "Okay," he said finally, simple, neutral, and stepped back another inch. And that should have been it. That should have been the end of the conversation, clean, easy, done, but it was not, because now there was this strange, quiet distance between us that felt heavier than before, like something had been said and unsaid at the same time, and I hated it, hated the way it lingered, so I turned away first, muttering something about needing to grab my laptop, anything to get out of that space, and I walked past him too quickly, brushing his shoulder just barely, accidental, completely accidental, except my body reacted like it was not, like it remembered something I was trying very hard to forget, and I froze for half a second before forcing myself to keep moving, because stopping would have been a mistake, stopping would have meant acknowledging it, and I was not doing that, absolutely not. I made it into my room and shut the door a little harder than necessary, leaning back against it with a breath I did not realize I had been holding, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at nothing, because this was ridiculous, completely ridiculous. It was just a shared space, just a lease, just a coincidence. People lived with roommates all the time without turning it into some kind of emotional disaster. So why was I acting like this was the end of the world? I pushed myself off the door and paced once across the room. Then again, because sitting still felt impossible, my thoughts looping back to the same problem over and over again. The fact that he was here, the fact that I could not leave, the fact that avoiding him was no longer an option. And the worst part, the part one refused to say out loud even in my own head, was that a small, traitorous part of me did not want it to be an option, and I stopped mid-step, immediately rejecting that thought. No, absolutely not. That was not happening. I was not going to romanticize this. I was not going to make it bigger than it was. I needed to set rules, boundaries, something solid to hold on to, because without that I was going to lose control of this situation faster than I could recover from it. And with that in mind, I straightened, grabbed my notebook from the desk like that somehow made this more official, more manageable, and opened the door again before I could overthink it, because if I waited any longer I would talk myself out of it, Lucas was still in the hallway. Of course he was. Like he had not moved at all. Like he had been waiting. And that thought alone made my chest tighten again. But I ignored it, stepping out with more confidence than I actually felt. "We need rules," I said, and he raised an eyebrow slightly, interest flickering. There in a way that made me regret opening my mouth almost immediately, but it was too late now. I had started this. I had to follow through. Ground rules, boundaries, whatever you want to call it. I continued, crossing my arms again because apparently that was my default defense mechanism now. "We keep things normal, we respect each other's space, and we do not." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to betray myself. "We do not complicate things." And there it was, hanging between us, the unspoken meaning clear as day. And Lucas watched me for a moment. Really watched me this time. Like he was measuring something. Like he was deciding something. And then, slowly, he nodded. "If that is what you need," he said. And something about the way he phrased it made my stomach twist, because it sounded less like agreement and more like he was giving me the illusion of control. And I was not sure if that made me feel better or worse. That should have made things easier. Having rules, having something defined, something structured. But instead it made everything feel sharper, more deliberate, like every move we made now had weight behind it. Like we were both constantly aware of the invisible lines we were not supposed to cross. And the worst part was how quickly I realized I was the only one actually trying to follow them. Because Lucas moved through the apartment like nothing had changed, like we had always lived like this. Like there was no tension humming under the surface, and I tried to match that. I really did. I stayed in the living room longer that evening, sat on the far end of the couch with my laptop open, pretending to focus on emails I had already read twice. But my attention kept drifting, pulled in directions I did not want to acknowledge, like the quiet sound of him moving around the kitchen, the low clink of dishes, the way the light shifted when he walked past the doorway, and I told myself it was fine. This was fine. This was normal. People shared spaces all the time. People coexisted without turning it into something complicated. Except my brain refused to cooperate, because every time he got within a few feet, my awareness spiked like I was being tracked by something invisible, and I hated that. Hated how automatic it was, how out of my control it felt. "You are staring." His voice cut through my thoughts suddenly. Calm but not teasing, just observant. And I snapped my eyes back to my screen so fast it probably made things worse. "I am not," I said immediately, even though we both knew that was not true. And I heard the faintest shift in his tone when he replied. Something almost like amusement, but softer. "Right?" he said, and I could practically feel his gaze on me for another second before he moved away again. And I exhaled slowly, trying to reset, trying to ground myself in something normal. Anything normal. But then the problem shifted again when the evening stretched into night, because sharing space during the day was one thing, but night was different, quieter, closer, the kind of quiet where every small sound carried farther than it should. And I realized that I had not thought about this part, had not considered what it would feel like to exist in the same apartment when everything slowed down, when there were no distractions left, just the awareness of him being somewhere on the other side of a wall. And I tried to ignore it. I really did. I went through my usual routine, brushed my teeth, changed into something comfortable, turned off the lights in my room. But the silence that followed felt heavier than usual, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, willing myself to fall asleep, counting seconds, counting breaths, anything to quiet my thoughts. Except it did not work, because every time I got close to drifting off, something pulled me back, a faint sound from the hallway, the soft click of a door, the almost imperceptible shift of footsteps, and my brain latched onto it immediately, hyper-aware, hyper-focused, like it was searching for something without my permission. And I turned onto my side with a frustrated sigh, pressing my face into the pillow because this was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. I should not care about where he was or what he was doing. I should not be this aware of someone just existing in the same apartment, and yet I was, and I hated it. Hated how my thoughts kept circling back to the same place, the same memory, the same moment I had spent all day trying to push away, and just when I was about to force myself to get up, to do something, anything to break the cycle, there was a soft knock on my door, barely there, just enough to be heard, and my entire body went still, because of course it would not be that easy. "Ethan," Lucas said quietly from the other side, and my name sounded different again, softer, less controlled, and I closed my eyes for a second, because whatever this was, whatever line we were about to approach, I had a feeling I was not as prepared to hold it as I thought. For a second I did not move, did not breathe, just stared at the door like it might disappear if I waited long enough. Because opening it meant breaking something I had spent the entire day trying to hold together, and I knew it. I knew the moment I reached for the handle there was no pretending this was simple anymore. What? I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended, and there was a pause on the other side. Not awkward, not rushed, just measured, like he was giving me time to decide. And that somehow made it worse. Can I come in? Lucas asked, and my brain immediately said no. Absolutely not. Bad idea. Terrible idea. But my hand was already moving before I could stop it, fingers wrapping around the handle, pulling the door open just enough to see him standing there in the dim hallway light, one hand resting loosely against the frame. Expression calm but softer than earlier, like something had shifted again, and I stepped back without thinking, a silent invitation I did not mean to give, and he noticed. Of course he did, stepping inside without hesitation but also without crowding me. Keeping that same careful distance he always seemed to calculate perfectly, and the door clicked shut behind him with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten, because now it was just us, no hallway, no buffer, no easy escape, just the small space of my room and the tension that followed him in like it belonged there. You said we should keep things normal, he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, and I nodded quickly, clinging to that like it was still solid ground. Yes, exactly, I replied, crossing my arms again even though it did nothing to steady me, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me in that way that made me feel like he was seeing more than I was saying. Then why are you acting like I am a problem you need to solve? He asked, and I blinked, caught off guard because that was not what I expected, not an accusation, not exactly, but something close enough that it made my defenses snap back into place. I am not, I said, a little sharper this time. Because if I let that question sink in too far I might actually have to answer it honestly. And I was not ready for that. Not even close. And he took a step closer. Just one. Closing the distance enough that I could feel the shift in the air again. The subtle change that made everything feel more immediate, more real. You are, he said quietly, not arguing, just stating it like a fact. And I shook my head, backing up instinctively until the edge of my bed pressed against the back of my knees, grounding me in place. I am just trying to keep things simple, I insisted, because that sounded better, safer, easier to defend, and he exhaled softly, not frustrated, not impatient, just understanding, which somehow made it worse. It does not feel simple, he replied, and there was something in his tone now, something honest, something that slipped past the controlled calm he usually carried, and that caught me off guard more than anything else had all day, because it meant I was not the only one feeling this, not the only one struggling to pretend this was nothing, and that realization hit harder than I expected, settling somewhere deep in my chest where I could not ignore it. And for a moment neither of us spoke, just stood there in that quiet, charged space, close enough to feel it, far enough to pretend we were not about to cross anything. And then he did something small, almost insignificant. He reached out just slightly, not touching, just close enough that I could feel the intention, like he was giving me the choice to step forward or step back, and my breath caught. Because suddenly it was not about rules or boundaries anymore. It was about whether I was going to keep pretending I did not feel anything at all, and I realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that I was running out of ways to avoid that answer. I did not move, not forward, not back, just stood there with my breath caught somewhere between panic and something I did not want to name. Because if I chose, if I made any kind of decision in this moment, it would mean admitting this was real, that whatever was happening between us was not just some leftover tension from one night. And I was not ready for that. I was absolutely not ready for that. So instead I did the only thing I could think of. I deflected. You should go, I said, and even to my own ears it sounded weak, like I did not believe it, like I was hoping he would not listen. And Lucas did not move immediately, did not step back, did not lower his hand. He just watched me for a second longer, like he was waiting, like he was giving me one last chance to say something different. And when I did not, when I stayed exactly where I was, frozen in my own contradiction, He finally dropped his hand and nodded once, slow, controlled, like he had expected this outcome all along. And something about that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because I did not want him to expect it. I did not want this to be predictable. I wanted it to be messy, uncertain, anything but this quiet understanding that felt like he had already figured me out. Right, he said, and turned toward the door, and for a split second I thought that was it, that he was just going to leave and everything would go back to the way it was before he knocked. Tense, but manageable, distant, but safe. But then his hand paused on the handle, and without turning back he added, "You are not as good at pretending as you think." And the words landed harder than anything else he had said, because they were not loud, not forceful, just honest in a way I was not prepared for. And before I could respond, before I could come up with something to counter that, to defend myself, he opened the door and stepped out, leaving it slightly ajar behind him, and I stood there for a second, staring at the space he had just occupied, like the air had not caught up yet, like something of him was still there. And then I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair, because this was getting out of control, completely out of control. I needed to reset, needed to get back to something that made sense, something that did not feel like it was slipping through my fingers every time I tried to hold on to it. So I moved quickly, crossing the room to shut the door, pressing it closed a little harder than necessary, like that could block everything out, like that could put a barrier back in place. And for a moment I leaned against it again, just like earlier, trying to steady my breathing, trying to ignore the way my thoughts kept replaying his words, the way they echoed louder the more I tried to dismiss them. Because he was wrong. He had to be wrong. I was perfectly capable of pretending. I had been doing it all day, had not I? Acting normal, setting boundaries, keeping my distance. Except the more I thought about it, the more I realized how thin that act actually was, how easily it cracked under the smallest pressure, how quickly it fell apart the moment he stepped a little too close or said something a little too direct. And that realization sat heavy in my chest, because it meant this was not just a temporary inconvenience, not just something I could ignore until it faded. This was something deeper, something that had already taken root whether I wanted it to or not. And I pushed myself off the door with a frustrated sigh, pacing once again because staying still felt impossible. And that was when I heard it, a soft thud from the other side of the wall, followed by the faint sound of movement, and my brain immediately latched onto it, tracking it without permission, mapping out where he was, what he might be doing, and I stopped mid-step, staring at the wall like I could see through it, like I could somehow put distance between us just by understanding where he was. And I hated it, hated how aware I still was, even with a door and a wall between us, even with space that should have been enough, because it was not enough, not anymore. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet, ordinary sounds of him existing just a few feet away, I realized something that made my stomach drop, something I had been trying very hard not to admit. Avoiding him was never going to work, not when he was this close, not when he was already this much a part of my space, and definitely not when a part of me was starting to wonder what would happen if I stopped trying altogether. Sleep did not come easily, not even close, because every time I closed my eyes my mind replayed everything in fragments. The way he looked at me, the way his voice shifted, the way he said I was not as good at pretending as I thought, and it lingered, stuck in my head like a line I could not unhear. So I gave up somewhere around 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling with a quiet frustration that had nowhere to go, until finally I pushed the covers off and sat up, because lying there, pretending to rest was worse than just admitting I was awake, and the apartment was silent now, heavier than before, like the night had settled into every corner, and I told myself I was just getting water, just something simple, normal, nothing to overthink. But even as I opened my door carefully, stepping into the dim hallway, I knew that was not entirely true, because part of me was listening, waiting, aware, and I hated that, hated how automatic it had become, but I kept moving anyway. Quiet steps, careful breathing, like I was trying not to disturb something fragile. And the kitchen light was still on, soft and low, casting just enough glow to make everything visible. And I stopped at the edge of it, because of course he was there, sitting at the counter with his back half turned, one elbow resting against the surface, a glass of water in his hand, like he had not gone to sleep either, like he had been here this whole time. And for a second I considered turning around, going back to my room, pretending I had not seen him, but it was too late, because he glanced up, meeting my eyes immediately, and there was that same calm awareness again, like he had known. I would show up eventually. Could not sleep, he said, not a question, just a statement. And I let out a small breath, stepping fully into the kitchen because retreating now would have been too obvious, too much like admitting something I was not ready to say. No, I replied, grabbing a glass from the cabinet just to give myself something to do, something to focus on that was not him, and for a moment we moved around each other in quiet, controlled motions, no collisions, no accidental touches, just that same careful distance that had been there all day, but it felt different now, softer in the quiet, less guarded and somehow more dangerous because of it, and I leaned against the counter across from him, taking a sip of water just to fill the silence. But it did not help, because the silence stretched anyway, thick and present, and I could feel his attention on me again, not heavy, not overwhelming, just there, steady, and I found myself looking back without meaning to, meeting his gaze for longer than I should have, longer than was safe, and something shifted in that moment, subtle but real, like the distance we had been trying to maintain all day was starting to blur at the edges. You keep saying it did not mean anything, he said quietly, breaking the silence in a way that felt inevitable, and my grip tightened slightly around the glass, because of course we were back here, of course this was not over, not really, and I looked away for a second, gathering something that felt like composure before meeting his eyes again. It did not, I repeated, but this time it sounded less certain, less convincing even to myself, and he did not argue, did not push, just watched me for a moment before setting his glass down with a soft, deliberate motion. Then why does it feel like you are trying so hard to prove it? He asked, and the question hit deeper than I expected, because it was not confrontational, not aggressive, just honest in a way that left no easy way out. And I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it again, to insist on the same answer I had been clinging to all day, but the words did not come as easily this time, because standing here, in the quiet, with nothing else to hide behind, I was starting to realize that maybe he was right, and that realization sat between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore, as the space that once felt like a boundary now felt like something else entirely, something I was not sure I knew how to step away from anymore. The question did not leave room to hide, and that was the problem, because I had gotten so used to dodging around it, reshaping it into something smaller, something manageable, but now it was right there, simple and direct, and I could feel it pressing in from all sides. I am not proving anything, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt thinner than before, like they had lost whatever weight they had been carrying all day. And Lucas did not look convinced, not even a little. He just watched me with that same steady focus, like he was waiting for me to catch up to something he already understood, and I hated that. Hated how easily he seemed to read through me, like I was not nearly as put together as I had been pretending to be, and I set my glass down a little too quickly, the soft sound echoing more than it should have in the quiet kitchen. You are overthinking this, I added, trying to shift the focus away from me, because if I kept talking, maybe I could steer this back into something safer, something less honest, and he tilted his head slightly, considering that, before letting out a small breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, but softer, less amused and more knowing. You are the one who cannot stop thinking about it, he said, and the words hit exactly where they were supposed to, because they were true in a way I could not easily dismiss, and I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it again, but nothing came out right away, because he was right, and that realization settled in my chest with an uncomfortable clarity, and I looked away, focusing on the counter, on anything that was not him, because meeting his gaze felt too much like admitting something I was not ready to say out loud. It was just one night, I said instead, quieter this time, less defensive, more like I was trying to convince myself than him, and the moment the words hung in the air, I knew they were not enough. Not anymore, because they did not explain why I could not stop replaying it, why I could not stop noticing him, why every small interaction felt heavier than it should have, and Lucas did not interrupt, did not correct me. He just stepped a little closer, not invading, not forcing, just closing that distance again in a way that felt intentional, like he was making it harder for me to retreat into my own excuses, and when I finally looked back up, he was already watching me, closer now, the space between us smaller than it had been all day, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because this was exactly what I had been trying to avoid, this moment where everything felt too real to ignore. If it was just one night, he said quietly, and his voice had shifted again, softer but more certain, like he was choosing his words carefully. Then why are you still here? And I blinked, thrown off for a second because I did not understand what he meant, but then it clicked, slow and unsettling, because he was not talking about the apartment. Not really, he was talking about this, about us standing here at 2 a.m. having the same conversation we had been circling all day, about the fact that I had not walked away, had not shut the door, had not ended this when I had the chance, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, something that was getting harder and harder to ignore. I live here, I said automatically, but even as I said it, I knew it was not the answer he was asking for, and his expression did not change, did not soften or harden, just stayed steady, like he was giving me time to figure it out, and the silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with everything I was not saying, everything I was still trying to avoid, and I realized, standing there in that quiet kitchen, that the question was not whether last night meant something. The question was whether I was willing to admit that it did, and for the first time since this started, I was not sure I could keep pretending that it did not. The silence stretched long enough that it started to feel like an answer on its own, like everything I was not saying was louder than anything I could force out, and I could feel it building in my chest, that pressure I had been holding back all day, all night, every second since I saw him standing in my kitchen like he belonged there, like he had always belonged there, and I swallowed, trying to find something steady to hold on to, something safe, but there was nothing left, not really, not when he was standing this close, not when his question was still hanging between us, simple and impossible at the same time, and I hated that I could not just walk away, hated that my feet stayed planted where they were, like moving would mean losing something I had not even admitted I wanted. I do not know, I said finally, and the words felt heavier than anything else I had said so far, because they were real, because they were not shaped or softened or hidden behind anything else, just the truth sitting there, exposed, and Lucas did not react right away, did not push, did not take advantage of it. He just watched me, and there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, less controlled, like he had not expected me to actually say that. And for a second that shifted something in the air between us, something that made it feel less like a confrontation and more like something else, something I was not sure I had a name for yet. And I let out a slow breath, running a hand through my hair because standing still felt impossible, because this felt like too much all at once. I was trying to make it simple. I added, softer now, like I was explaining it more to myself than to him. And he nodded slightly, like he understood that part at least, like he could see why I had been trying so hard to reduce this into something manageable, something that would not disrupt everything else, and that somehow made it easier to keep talking. It was easier to say it did not matter than to. I stopped, because finishing that sentence meant going somewhere I had not gone yet, meant admitting something I had been avoiding since the beginning, and the hesitation lingered for just a second too long, because Lucas stepped a little closer again, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to remind me he was still here, still listening, still part of this whether I wanted him to be or not. Then to what? He asked quietly, and I closed my eyes for a second, because there it was, the point I had been circling around all day, all night, every thought leading back to it whether I wanted it to or not. And when I opened them again, I met his gaze directly, because if I was going to say it, I needed to at least be honest about it, then to admit that it did. I said, and the words landed between us with a kind of finality that made everything else fade for a moment, like the room itself had gone quieter just to make space for them. And I felt something shift again, not sharp this time, not overwhelming, just real, solid in a way that made it impossible to ignore anymore. And Lucas did not look surprised, not exactly. But there was something in the way his shoulders eased slightly, something in the way his gaze softened just a fraction, like he had been waiting for that, like he had known I would get there eventually. And that realization should have annoyed me, should have made me pull back, but it did not this time, because for the first time since this started, I was not trying to run from it, not trying to reshape it into something easier to handle. I was just standing there, in it, letting it exist without immediately pushing it away, and the space between us felt different now. Less like a boundary and more like something fragile, something that could tip in either direction depending on what happened next. And Lucas glanced down briefly, then back at me, like he was making a decision, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than it had been all night. "Then we do not have to pretend," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not complicated, not dramatic, just a quiet suggestion that somehow felt bigger than anything else we had said, and I let out a small, unsteady breath, because for the first time, the idea of not pretending did not feel like something to fear, it felt like something I was not sure I could walk away from anymore. The words settled between us, quiet but irreversible, and for a moment neither of us moved, like we both understood that whatever came next would shift things in a way we could not take back, and I felt it, that hesitation, that instinct to retreat, to rebuild the distance I had spent all day trying to protect, but it did not come as easily this time, not when I had already said too much, not when the truth was already out in the open where I could not hide it again, and Lucas did not rush it, did not step forward or close the space. He just stood there, giving me room to decide, and somehow that made it harder, not easier, because it meant this was on me now, this next step, this moment where I either leaned into it or pulled away again, and I hated how aware I was of everything. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint glow of the kitchen light, the way the air felt heavier between us like it was holding something fragile in place, and I let out a slow breath, steadying myself. Because standing there frozen was not an answer, and I was tired of pretending I did not have one. "It is not that simple," I said finally, because it was the only thing I could grab onto, the only piece of resistance I had left that still felt true, and his gaze did not waver, did not challenge it, just stayed on me, patient, waiting, and I shook my head slightly, trying to organize thoughts that refused to line up properly. "We live together now," I added, like that explained everything, like that alone should be enough reason to keep things contained, controlled, safe. And he nodded once, acknowledging it, but not stepping away from the point. "Yes," he said, calm, steady, and I exhaled again, running a hand through my hair, because this was exactly the problem, because he was not making this complicated, he was not pushing or forcing anything. He was just standing here, offering something simple and honest, and that was what made it so hard to refuse, because there was no easy excuse left, no obvious reason to shut it down other than the fact that it scared me, that the idea of letting this become something real felt like stepping into something I could not control, and I shifted my weight, glancing down for a second before looking back at him, because avoiding his gaze felt pointless now. "What if it makes things worse?" I said, quieter this time, more honest than I had been earlier, and there it was, the real concern, the one I had been hiding under everything else, not just the fear of what this was, but the fear of what it could become, and Lucas was quiet for a second, considering that, not dismissing it, not brushing it off, just taking it in like it mattered. And then he stepped a little closer again, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to narrow the space between us into something more intentional. "It might," he said, and I blinked, caught off guard because I had expected reassurance, expected him to say it would be fine, that it would work out, something easy and comforting. But he did not. He just said the truth, and that somehow grounded the moment in a way I was not expecting. "But pretending it does not exist is not making it better," he added, and that landed just as hard as everything else had tonight. Because he was right, because every attempt I had made to ignore this had only made it more obvious, more present, more impossible to push away, and I stood there for a second, letting that settle, letting myself actually feel it without immediately trying to fix it or hide from it. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough that the space between us no longer felt like a barrier, but something shared, something we were both standing inside of, and my pulse picked up immediately, sharp and undeniable. But this time I did not step back, did not retreat, I just stayed there, meeting his gaze, holding it. And for the first time since this started, it did not feel like I was losing control. It felt like I was choosing not to run from it anymore, and Lucas noticed. Of course he did. Something shifting in his expression again, something softer, more certain, and he did not reach out, did not close the space further. He just stayed where he was, letting me set the pace, letting me decide how far this would go, and I realized, standing there in the quiet of the kitchen, that maybe this was not about avoiding something anymore. Maybe it was about whether I was ready to stop fighting something that was already there. The moment stretched in a quiet, fragile way, like something balanced on the edge of change, and I could feel it in the way my chest tightened, in the way my breath came slower, more deliberate, like my body was trying to match the pace of whatever this was becoming. And Lucas did not move, did not rush it. He just stayed there, close enough that the space between us felt intentional, like it mattered. And for the first time, I was not trying to fill it with excuses or distance. I was just there, letting it exist, and it was unsettling, but not in the way it had been before, not sharp or overwhelming, just unfamiliar, like stepping into something new without knowing exactly where it would lead. And I swallowed, my gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, because looking away felt like retreating, and I was starting to understand that I did not want to do that anymore. "We are going to have to see each other every day," I said quietly, not as a warning this time, but as a reality I was trying to wrap my head around. And he nodded slightly, like he had already accepted that part, like it was not something that needed to be questioned. And I let out a small breath, because saying it out loud made it feel more real, more immediate, like this was not just a moment in the middle of the night, but something that would follow us into every part of the day, into every shared space, every casual interaction, every quiet second where neither of us could pretend the other was not there. So if this turns into something complicated, I trailed off, because I did not have a clear ending for that thought, just a vague sense of everything that could go wrong, everything that could become harder, messier, more difficult to navigate. And Lucas watched me for a second, his expression steady but softer than before, like he understood what I was trying to say even when I could not finish it. "Then we deal with it," he said simply, and the answer was so straightforward it caught me off guard again, because I kept expecting something more, something heavier, but he kept bringing it back to something grounded, something real, and I felt something shift in my chest at that, something that made the situation feel less like a problem I needed to solve, and more like something I could actually face. And I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him, because I needed a second to process that, to let it settle into something I could hold on to. And the silence that followed was different now, not tense, not strained, just quiet in a way that felt almost steady, like we had moved past something without fully realizing it. And I became aware again of how close we were standing, of the small details I had been trying not to focus on earlier, the way his posture had relaxed slightly, the way his gaze stayed on me without pressure, just present. And I hesitated for a fraction of a second before shifting my weight forward just a little more, not enough to close the space completely, just enough to acknowledge it, to stop pretending it was not there. And my pulse picked up again, but this time I did not pull back, did not retreat. I just stayed there, letting the moment settle around us. And Lucas noticed, of course he did, something flickering in his expression, something that felt like recognition, like he understood what that small movement meant. And he did not push it further, did not take more than I was giving. He just stayed with me in that space, steady and patient. And I realized, standing there in the quiet of the kitchen with the soft light and the faint hum of everything around us, that this was not about avoiding something anymore. It was about learning how to stay, how to exist in this without immediately trying to run from it. And that realization did not feel as overwhelming as I thought it would. It felt possible, in a way I had not expected, and I let out a quiet breath, meeting his gaze. Again, not guarded this time, not defensive, just present. And for the first time since all of this started, the idea of tomorrow did not feel like something I needed to dread. It felt like something I was not entirely afraid to face. Morning came too fast, soft light spilling through the kitchen window like nothing had changed, like the night before had not shifted something fundamental between us. And for a second I stood in the hallway, watching that light stretch across the floor, trying to decide if I was going to pretend again, if I was going to rebuild the distance I had spent so long trying to maintain. But the thought felt heavier now, less convincing, like something that no longer fit the situation we had stepped into. And I let out a slow breath before moving forward, because avoiding this was not an option anymore, not after everything that had already been said. And the kitchen looked the same, familiar and unchanged, except he was there again, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand, like he had been there long enough to settle into the space. like this was already becoming routine, and when he glanced up and saw me, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just that same steady awareness, like we had not left anything unresolved between us, like he trusted that we had moved past it. And that realization hit in a quiet way, because it meant something had shifted not just for me, but for him too. "Morning," he said, simple and easy, and I nodded, stepping into the kitchen without stopping this time, without that instinct to pause or retreat, because the space did not feel like something I needed to navigate carefully anymore. It just felt shared. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a mug from the cabinet, the same one he had used yesterday, and I hesitated for half a second before reaching for it anyway, because that small choice felt like more than it should have, like a quiet acknowledgement of something I was no longer trying to deny, and I poured coffee, focusing on the motion just long enough to steady myself before turning back toward him. And for a moment we just stood there, no tension, no forced distance, just a quiet understanding settling into place. And it was strange, unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, not in the way it had been before, and I leaned back against the counter across from him, mirroring his posture without thinking, and he noticed, of course he did, something subtle shifting in his expression, not surprise, not satisfaction, just recognition, like he understood what that meant without needing to point it out, and the silence between us was different now, not filled with avoidance or uncertainty, just quiet in a way that felt steady, like we had reached something we did not have to question anymore. "So," I said after a second, because I felt like I should say something, even though the silence was not uncomfortable, just new. And he raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting, and I let out a small breath, glancing down at my mug before looking back at him. "We are not pretending anymore," I finished, and the words felt lighter than I expected, like saying them out loud did not carry the same weight they had the night before, like they fit into this space more easily than I thought they would. And he nodded once, simple and certain. "No," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no second guessing, just quiet agreement. And something in my chest eased at that, something that had been tight for longer than I realized, and I took a small sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle before speaking again, because there was still something else, something I needed to say, but we are also not rushing into anything, I added, more carefully this time, because that mattered too, because this was still new, still something we were figuring out, and he considered that for a moment before nodding again, just as steady. "We go at your pace," he said, and that simple sentence landed deeper than anything else he had said so far, because it was not about control, not about pushing forward, it was about giving me space without stepping away, and I held his gaze for a second longer, something quiet and certain settling in my chest, because for the first time, this did not feel like something I needed to escape from. It felt like something I could step into without losing myself. And as I stood there in the soft morning light, sharing the same space with him without trying to shrink away from it, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. This was not about being forced to live together anymore. It was about what we chose to do with that. And for the first time, I was not trying to run from the answer.